All right, folks, we know that everybody's over there still recovering several days later from that Thanksgiving turkey and all of that. And of course, people are still dealing with what's been going on with the pandemic and, of course, the American economy slowly but surely, hopefully, trying to get back to normal and all of that. Of course, the holiday season is always a time that we learn whether this is going to be a good year or a bad year, because a lot of times the holiday shopping is what determines what's going to happen in that early part of the year as well. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in that regards. The weather is starting to feel a lot more seasonable, because there was a time that I was sitting there going like, wait a minute, it's November. It was definitely in the 70s and things like that here in Durham, North Carolina. And yes, it was. But now we're having more seasonal like weather. And who knows, it might stay that way. Or we might have 70s in December or January. There's no telling. The weather just seems to have a mind of its own and does what it wants to in that regard. So we're going to bring in our guest, Jonathan Joseph, see what he's got going on in his life. I know that he's very much involved in the fashion world, but also involved in entrepreneurship and things along those lines. I've had the pleasure of meeting some tremendous guests, both in the world of podcast guests and also in the world of Clubhouse. So definitely there are all kinds of places that you can find amazing guests. And this is one that I learned from podcast guests. So definitely always glad to find new and amazing guests that are interested to come in, share their story, share what they're all about, and let us know what they've got going on in their world. So always glad to find fascinating people that are doing amazing things. And definitely Jonathan is one of those. So glad that Jonathan has been able to appear here. Jonathan does not know this, but I actually have a cousin that is involved somewhat in the fashion industry. He's actually Native American heritage, and we most of my family primarily identifies as African American, but we do have some that are very much involved in the Native American culture, the Native American heritage. I've got one cousin that is very much involved in the powwow circuit, and then this particular brother of hers is actually got his own company, Red Eye Supply. So they supply Native American wear and things along those lines. So that is one of my connections
Awesome.
to the fashion industry. And then I'm here in Durham, North Carolina, and there is a couple of fashion ties. One, I'm on the board of the Carolina Theater, and one of my newer board members, in terms of sharing that board space, is an editor for none other than Vanity Fair. So she works for Vanity Fair and the things along those lines. And then here in Durham, one of the leading Vogue editors, and he's been down there for a number of years, is none other than Andre Leon Talley, who spent a lot of his time being raised here in Durham, went to high school here, and I think he went to college here as well, but definitely went to high school at Hillside here in this area. So he is definitely considered a local hero and all of that. So how, Jonathan, did you even get involved in the wonderful world of fashion?
That is a long story and a short story all at once. First of all, Mark, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to share the stage with you. I got started in fashion on a professional trajectory through the lens of consulting. I've been a strategic consultant both to for-profits and nonprofits for the better part of the past 15 years. And so, in the course of that, after freelancing for a while, I ended up doing a lot of consultation in luxury women's wear and sportswear on the business side of fashion relative to fundraising management, getting capital in the door to grow lines. And then that sort of bled into co-designing different collections, fabric sourcing, textiles, and it just kind of spiraled from there. And I was happy to do that for a number of years. But in the course of my time doing that work within the fashion industry, I noticed a lot of things that were problematic, things that I didn't like, that didn't sit so well with me as a member of multiple, historically marginalized communities. There were just too many issues, and I came across too many people whose imagination stopped at a size 4, or were perpetuating very negative, either culturally appropriative stereotypes or any number of the obias and isms that plague the industry. And I thought, let me step away and solve some of these issues. And so that is how I came to start Little Red Fashion, which is the first edtech and publishing company in the industry focused on fashion education for kids. Because I think it is much easier to build up empowered and conscious children than it is to later fix broken adults who have, suffered at the hands of the messaging and or mechanics of the fashion industry for decades.
You actually brought up an interesting point, which is, and something that I've definitely been paying attention to, and that is the kind of way that the fashion industry does play toward certain sizes and certain stereotypes and things of that nature. And I do definitely have friends that are in that larger size population of the women population, and they sometimes get frustrated by that because they're sitting there going like, it's not advertising toward us, it's not even trying to show us that it wants to sell to us as well. So whether they may be a size 14 or a size 16 or whatever sizes they may be, all the advertising seems to be very much geared toward those that, like you said, would be probably more in that Twiggy mindset. So I was just wondering how you have been able to, even on an educational level, get people past that kind of mindset. Because I even see it with some of my kids. So some of the kids are also kind of getting caught up in the like culture. We've even been seeing this during the pandemic. Everybody wants to get the most likes and things along those lines.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a number of sort of intersecting factors that I think are affecting young kids today relative to the fashion space. For one thing, even the language we use, and this is the writer in me, right? Coming back to the language, the average American woman is like somewhere between a 12 and a 14. You know what I mean? So even when we call it plus size or extended sizing, that's really a misnomer because the bulk of Americans are that size. That is normal. That's average. You are not an outlier. But fashion companies, by and large, especially as you go towards the higher end and luxury side of things, really don't create for most people. They create for a very slim demographic, pun intended, and you know, that's a problem. And I think what we have seen in recent years in the fashion tech side of things are more attempts to create inclusive sizing runs, more attempts to cut down on costs within the supply chain at the prototyping level or the sample level. So with that, you know, a lot of companies are moving to technologies like Browseware or Clo3D to do all of their prototyping and sample making digitally so that they can save money and hopefully use that money to then create extended sizing or inclusive sizing. From an educational standpoint, I think it's about transparency. A big part of Little Red's vision is really that we're trying to peel back the curtain on how the sausage is made, because if you know that you're being marketed to, if you are empowering kids by being media literate, you are putting them a step ahead of this sort of subconscious programming that advertising and marketing runs on.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that and everything. One of the other things we've been hearing a lot of conversations about, it's actually even come up on this particular network and everything, is this whole idea of diversity and inclusion. You actually alluded to it in your beginning and everything along those lines. We've actually got some folks that are on our platform who I know we do a World Edition show that sometimes feel that it is something that we shouldn't be doing as much of. I do not necessarily agree with them, but I was just wondering your thoughts as one that comes from a couple of marginalized societies, how you would address people that feel that this whole conversation, because they would even bring up the example of like Pepsi and them maybe being forced to talk about diversity rather than wanting to do it on their own volition, for lack of a better term. And everything.
I mean, I think that diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in the cultural zeitgeist right now are often getting lumped together with things that are sensationalized by certain news outlets and mainstream media. For example, this confluence, this confluence between diversity, equity, and inclusion and critical race theory, for example. Big hot topic, especially as someone in the education space, something that parents bring to school boards. We've seen clips of these all over the mainstream media. And the fact of the matter is that critical race theory is a legal scholarly framework for analyzing debate, case law, and other things in law schools. That's what critical race theory does. It has to do with interpretations of law. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is something that has now been sort of buzzworded together with that for a lot of people. And I just, first and foremost, want to disabuse people of the notion that those are the same things, because they're not. I think diversity, equity, and inclusion is essential for many reasons, particularly as a children's book publisher and author. All children, no matter where they come from, what their families look like, what their future is going to be, deserve to feel seen, valued, heard, and have materials, media, and things that they're consuming as children that honor that and that make it apparent that the world is meeting them where they're at. And they can see themselves in characters, they can see themselves in storylines facing similar challenges. To those that say, Pepsi's being forced to cram diversity down our throats. You hear some form of that kind of verbiage a lot, like, oh, why'd you have to go and ruin this with some forced diversity? And I really want people to understand that those who are being represented through DEI initiatives, who are gaining more prominence in various character universes, whatever ones they may be, we were always here. Historically, marginalized groups have always been here, and their presence in storylines, their presence in cinematographic universes, all those things, whatever it might be, it's not forcing anything. It's merely reflecting the reality that has not been adequately balanced prior. As a culture, we have failed to adequately represent all sorts of groups from all sorts of walks of life. And so this sort of equilibrium, finding an equilibrium where we have genuine representation that's got some parity with real life, that process is going to be messy inherently, because certain groups are used to being the default, and the status quo runs on defaults. And so as those defaults shift, as we gain different consciousness about how we can better meet the realities of a diverse, pluralistic society through our media, there's going to be people on both sides that feel strongly one way or another. My goal with Little Red Fashion is to make sure that we have something within our library for everyone. Whether you are, a hijabi and you want a book that celebrates Muslim culture and the hijab and niqab and abaya, all those things, whether, that's another bridge to dialogue. I view our role as a broker. It's almost like our job is to be a broker of conversations. And through fashion, because of its ubiquity, we can talk about all of these issues, whether it's Islamophobia, whether it is body and size inclusivity, whether it's disability. And visibility for those marginalized groups. I think what I find so beautiful about our mission is that fashion tends to be this sort of neutral space where we can all relate to something related to fashion. And so hopefully through that, we can neutralize some of the spiciness surrounding these topics on both sides of the equation and come to a common understanding through the threads that we do share, because I think that through clothing, we get a chance to have a window into cultures we may not have previously thought we could understand. And so, I think it behooves anyone who's focused on education to just step back from the politics of it all and just focus on the fact that children are innocent, okay? Children do not have control over where they're born, what their families are like, and who they are in terms of their intrinsic being. So is it really so bad to be giving them resources that have people like them in it? I don't think so. I don't think anyone would argue that all children deserve to feel empowered by the things that they're consuming in terms of media. And so if someone thinks that's us, forcing a diversity down people's throats, that's on them. I welcome them to have a conversation as to why exactly they think it's a bad thing for all children to find resources that see and value them for who they are. And I'm always open to these conversations. I think conversation is at the heart of everything we do as a company. What I've done for years as either an activist or a consultant. It's about creating dialogue and telling stories.
No, it's all about creating dialogue. There's no doubt about that and everything. Now I'm going to bring up another thing about fashion. I definitely want to get to some of the hard-hitting issues as well. But before we get to that, why do you think that just in general, fashion is important? And I'm going to just tell you a little bit of a story about my own fashion style, because I am definitely a jeans and a t-shirt kind of guy. And that's usually what I'm wearing. I mean, right now I've got on my Marquette sweatshirt and everything. But I do remember there was a time in my life when I was wearing a lot of brown and khakis and things of that nature. And I want to say that at one point, my younger brother was like, no, this is not going to work. He did the same thing with my hairstyle, because he actually is the one that got me to go on a fairly consistent basis. And I'm due for another trip, because I try to go about every 2 or 3 weeks to the barbershop. But he did get tired of seeing me in beige, and it was that beige kind of brown and everything, and he definitely called me out on it. And of course, this was several decades ago when I was much younger, probably in my 30s or something like that. But I do hear people oftentimes wonder about your fashion style, no matter what it is. And some people are more casual. I would argue that I'm a very casual person, and some people have fashion styles that are based on their interests. Like, I've got a good friend that is into the funk music space, and so he definitely has a little bit of a more eclectic style in his fashion, and I could give some other examples as well. But I was just wondering, why is fashion important, and do you need to develop your own style, or do you need to like run to Little Red Fashion or some of the other more prominent stores and get stuff that you are comfortable with? How do you look at fashion? Because a lot of times when we think of
Sure.
fashion, we think of it in that corporate world of like the big fashion shows.
So I have a big tent philosophy on fashion that encompasses what others might call dress and costume, fashion versus dress versus costume, right? Personally, it's not even necessarily about your personal style in the sense that fashion is important because it means different things to different people. For someone who's a clothes horse, who's a fashionista, or whatever term you want to use, the connection is very obvious. But for someone who's not, it might be as simple as when my mother passed away when I was 19, right? So I often think of, nostalgia is often evoked for many people through our loved ones and what they wore. If you talk to those who are going through bereavement of any kind, they'll talk about having to empty so-and-so's clothes out of the closet,
Right.
or that special ring that grandma gave me that I remember her wearing. We all forge stories through clothing that we may not even realize until it's brought to our attention. And so the goal with Little Red Fashion is to view fashion through this lens, or use fashion as a lens to view ourselves, to view other cultures and societies. And for those who do want to get into the industry, have like the fashion bug and they're really into it, give them, those kids, as much information as their peers get when they're trying to learn how to play the clarinet or play football or learn about theater. Fashion as an art form is not only valid, but is only increasing in interest. We've had a generation of shows like Making the Cut, Next in Fashion, Project Runway. Fashion is at the intersection of things like music, entertainment, and the arts. And so I think fashion is all of those things. It is an art. It is a vehicle for self-expression. For kids, I think what it is it's an exploration of agency. You can, if we could get Elmo on the line, we could talk about how teaching children how to dress themselves helps them establish decision-making skills, agency over themselves and their self-identity. We can really start to understand that fashion's not just, as you put it, corporate fashion with a capital F, but is instead an entire way of viewing the world, whether it be personally, politically, socioeconomically, or ecologically, in the case of fast fashion and its ramifications on, global warming, for example. I mean, in terms of labor, in terms of human rights, we could talk about fashion in that vein too, and talk about the fact that it's the third most labor-intensive industry ahead of, next to agriculture and defense, with less than like 1% of those people making a living wage globally. So fashion, because of its sheer size and the breadth and depth of its impact on the economy, affects all of us, even if we don't think it does, even if we're casual t-shirt and jeans type of people. Chances are, whether in the micro or the macro, fashion has affected your life in some way. Our job at Little Red Fashion is to create tools, books, resources, and experiences that make that more apparent, make it more accessible, and use it, as I said earlier, to broker more conversations between kids and grown-ups about the world around them.
That makes a lot of sense. Other thing that I've heard about fashion, I actually just finished doing an event actually last week called the Black Business Olympics. It was actually like a business conference within the African American population. And AR and the metaverse did come up several times along with blockchain technology. And I am kind of wondering what the impact will be for small companies like you with augmented reality and metaverses, and whether you feel that those
Oh,
are
sure.
good things within fashion or whether these are things that could hurt the fashion industry.
Oh, I think it's a win on all fronts. Honestly, I'm very bullish on the metaverse. I'm very bullish on, the way the fashion industry can grow community through it. We have had our designs on the metaverse for a number of months now. I would say about 9 months we've been putting together our roadmap for Web3, for putting together things like NFT projects, decentralized autonomous organizations committed to fashion archives, and creating metaverse-friendly spaces where we can showcase both the work of emerging digital and in real life, tangible designers, but also working with cultural institutions like museums and others to, for example, fund the 3D scanning of extant garments within collections. If you are LACMA or MoMA or the Costume Institute or, any fashion collection in a serious academic sense, you full well know that you can't bust out these clothes that might be 100 years old all the time for exhibition because they'll fall apart. But if you can work through an active digital preservation for the metaverse to 3D scan extant garments within your collection, you then gain digital assets that you can use to teach about that fashion, that you can use to tokenize it, create NFTs and limited collections based on the garments you have in your collection to raise funds. We have a lot of plans in store at Little Red Fashion for all of these Web3 avenues, whether it be metaverse experiences, digital experiences that bridge the physical and digital, whether that be through special events that have a component that's mirrored within the metaverse, or in the case of, even our book, we're working on creating augmented reality activations throughout our titles. So there are 4 activations within the Little Red Dress that will drop in 2022. Those who've ordered the book will also receive a sticker pack, and kids can decide which, where on the page they want to put the marker that activates the AR. Within those activations, we use it as a tool to enhance the narratives within the book. Through conversations with a number of independent booksellers, we learned that most of the big 5 publishers are using AR in a sort of entertainment gimmicky way. It's Thomas the Tank Engine, goes across your dining room table, or so-and-so superhero flies around your living room. And that's all well and good, and it's a shiny object kind of thing. But it's not edtech, and it's not, from a publishing perspective, using the whole cow, if I can use that metaphor, in the sense that you're already writing a book to teach kids about something. So why not use the technology at our disposal to then create interactive experiences within the book that enhance that learning, that go a little bit deeper down the rabbit hole, not so far that it breaks up the flow of the story, but so that, a couple little elements will tell you when, you see the Little Red Dress going down the runway on Kiki, our model, maybe you'll learn a little bit about Pat Cleveland being an iconic black fashion model. Maybe you'll learn a little bit about Hubert de Givenchy and his all-black cabine in the 70s and how that was important, and so on and so on. And so through each of our Little Red titles, which are our picture books, there'll be a number of AR activations, but we are also working on early chapter readers, which, while still containing illustrative elements, are not AR enhanced, because it's important to me to understand that where this technology is right now, it is not universally accessible. Not every child has access to a smartphone with a camera. Not every child has access to a tablet at home. So if we made all digital resources, or resources that were all focused on that, I wouldn't consider that fair or equitable. And so our goal is to balance our digital offerings with other offerings as well, that drive the same and similar points home. So as I said, I'm very bullish on augmented reality, the metaverse, NFTs, all of that. I do recognize, of course, from a sustainability angle, that certain elements of blockchain technology are absolutely not as eco-friendly as they could or should be in their current form, even though all major blockchains are working on, green or more sustainable and more efficient versions of their tech outside of Bitcoin, which is an outlier. And so, is that ideal? No, but it's leading edge technology, and you got to start somewhere. And so I'm still comfortable with, our mission and our commitment to also teaching about sustainability, despite being bullish on Web3, which some may see as being at odds.
No, I definitely can understand that. One of the shows that airs on LinkedIn, and I'm friends with a lot of the people that are on LinkedIn in the sense of like folks that have their own live streams and things of that nature, is a show done by 2 friends of mine. I'm actually the one to put them together and everything, that being Tim Sohn and Kara Oker. Tim Sohn is a dealing with cancer in his own life and things of that nature. And Kara is actually lost her mother not that long ago to the whole breast cancer and things of that nature. And I saw that was part of your story as well. Yes. So just wondering how much of that is also what drives you in your own career and things along those lines. Because I can tell you it was a very emotional show that Kara had, where she was explaining what she went through with her mom and her mom's passing. I want to say it was maybe 5 or 6 years ago and things along those lines. But it was definitely a moving show that I was watching as I was watching her and Tim explore that thing on a new show that they have here on a regular basis.
I mean, it directly influences me for sure. My mother passed away, as I said briefly, when I was 19 years old after an almost lifelong struggle with metastatic breast cancer. She had breast cancer for 26 years before it took her. So that was all of my life, having had her pass when I was only 19. And through that, part of it, I mean, aside from the fact that our first book in the company writ large is, dedicated to my mother, I really learned through the process of being a caretaker for a parent with cancer, losing a parent early in life at the age of 19, especially as someone who's also adopted, which complicates the calculus, one might say. I learned perseverance. I don't think you can be an entrepreneur, particularly one that's breaking multiple barriers across fairly entrenched industries like fashion and publishing, especially, without an element of dogged determination. And when you grow up with a parent facing a terminal illness, in talking to other people that went through the same kind of thing, I've learned that we kind of somewhat have two camps, right? There's people who have that experience and it takes them to a place of despair, and it's very hard for them to get out of it. Or, as in my case, it pushes you to try and understand what element of my mother's tenacity is it that got her through all those chemo treatments, that got her through numerous rounds of radiation, that was able to have her navigate the world in the way in which she did, particularly as someone who also has my own disability, cerebral palsy, ataxic CP. So I was a disabled kid with a disabled mom, co-navigating reality that wasn't built for where we were at, essentially. So when it comes to Little Red Fashion, it follows to me rather intuitively that, of course, a core part of my mission is helping kids also navigate realities like the fashion industry that were not made for them or that were not necessarily created for them. I directly attribute my ability to process my living with CP from childhood into adulthood and thriving with it to my mother and the lessons that she taught me, some of which were through fashion. And my earliest fashion memories, and we talk about this in Little Red Fashion in our weekly interview sessions on Thursdays and that we put on our IGTV. What are your earliest fashion memories? We often talk to our guests about that from across the industry. And some of mine are related to my mom saying to me, you have your leg braces, your AFO braces. Kids are kids. They're going to bully you. I was getting bullied for the leg braces. And she said, okay, we're going to do something about it. And we're going to make it something you like. So I always loved putting outfits together. And her thing was, okay, Jonathan, we're going to go to the garment district. We're going to, go find all the socks we can that are long enough to pull over the leg braces. Think of like soccer, shin guard type moment, and then either match outfits to the socks, or if you find an outfit that we like, and then we'll go and take it with us until we find the sock that matches the thing. And so over time, as a kid, that became a thing I became proud of. I went from being bullied for my leg braces to being like, well, I have these really cool leg braces with these great socks that match my outfits. I don't know what you're on about. And that was a really empowering way to, and I credit her greatly, to teach me to take pride in something that was a disability from the outside. And it's something that I also recall, when she would get ready for chemo, and she was, parents often like to keep that stoic, like, I'm handling this, I'm not going to let my kids see me break down or be sad or like, that kind of a thing. If she was feeling that, she would throw on this one pair of vintage Dior sunglasses that I still have to this day, and then once those were on, like it was like her game face, she was like ready to go get the transfusion. She was ready to go do that. And this idea of fashion as armor, especially, or fashion as a vehicle for autonomy or agency, is central to what we do at Little Red Fashion and central to the messaging we're trying to send to children, which is you can use fashion as a vehicle to articulate who you are, and you have control over that, and you can use it to be proud of your culture that you come from, even if other people may not understand it, or you can use it as a way to memorialize the things about yourself that you're most proud. And so I think that's a direct result of my mom's influence and living with chronic illness, both myself and observing her going through what she did.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I noticed that part of the disabilities that you have yourself, you mentioned the cerebral palsy, but you also have attention deficit kind of things going on as well. And it's, in my mind, and I've definitely got dysgraphia, which is a form of dyslexia. Means if you tell me to go left and right, I might get a little confused. It might take a minute, and that's why I depend more on mass transit than cars and things along those lines. There might be some other things that play into that as well. But I was just wondering, even with the Little Red Fashion and the book that you're doing and everything, how do you tie in the disability community, because a lot of times there are the disabilities that we know and see that are very obvious, like cerebral palsy,
Sure.
like MS. I've got relatives that have got MS, like a number of other things, but there are others that are not as obvious, and sometimes in my
For
mind
sure.
misdiagnosed, because a lot of our kids are hyper anyway. So I think that sometimes, particularly in our urban cities, some of those kids that were on Ritalin maybe didn't need it as much as
Didn't.
others. I'm
Oh
not saying
yeah.
that attention deficit disorder and those things don't exist, but I am saying that sometimes I do wonder if we don't overdiagnose that particular thing, because most kids that I know, including my two nephews, somewhat hyper.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple things to unpack there. First of all, I'm glad you brought up invisible disabilities, because yes, when I was a small child, my disability was very obvious to any outside observer because I had leg braces, eye patch, this, that, and the third. But then I got older, and I didn't need the leg braces anymore, and I'd gone through hundreds of hours of occupational and physical therapy. So me now, 35-year-old male adult, you don't really notice my disability. It's relatively invisible, but I can assure you my hip pain is definitely there. There's invisible disabilities are everywhere. And the fact is, most of our team at Little Red Fashion has some form of a learning disability, whether that is ADHD, dyslexia, dysgraphia, anxiety. We are constantly thinking about ways in which we can make our materials more accessible to kids with learning disabilities, because we all have them. And so if you look, that's part of why the AR was such a key focus for me, because a lot of statistics show that children with learning disabilities, particularly ADHD, often engage better with interactive and digital materials and retain more information over time from those materials rather than a traditional book. So, that's at the fore for me. And we're very lucky through our Little Red Literacy program to have received some funding from the Emily Hall Tremaine Foundation, which does have a very large focus on learning disabilities and empowering those who have them to find and build the resources that they need. So when we talk about disability sort of writ large, outside of just learning disabilities as well, we're building for the long haul. We are early in our growth as a company at Little Red Fashion. And so our second title that's coming out is called the Little Red Kit. So Little Red Kit is all about soccer or football. If you're a Ted Lasso fan who's watching, football is life. And we are telling the story of soccer through sort of a Timon and Pumbaa style duo of best friends, one of whom has cerebral palsy and one of whom does not. And they bond over their, jersey trading and their teams. And one of them, the one who does not have CP, the one who has CP, loves kits. He's obsessed with the iconography of crests and how uniforms change over time for the European clubs like Juventus and others. And that shared binary relationship between the two of them, bouncing their love of soccer off of each other, gives us a vehicle to, again, broker those conversations through fashion about what does it mean to have a friend who has a disability? What does it mean to stand up to bullies and be an ally to your friend if they do have a disability? What does it mean as someone who has a disability when the world is always trying to kind of patronize you? I know that when I was a young kid and grown-ups would see my leg braces or whatever, there is this subconscious automatic assumption that I was also developmentally delayed, or that I needed things infantilized for me. Maybe they'll talk explicitly slower in a way that, as someone who does not, there's just these subtle microaggressions, might be the word some might use, that books like this, books like ours, can deconstruct in a really relatable way, again, through clothing, because everyone understands, they just love their soccer jerseys. Okay, this is a story about learning about, technical fashion and sports fashion, but we're dovetailing it with these really important messages about allyship, disability, and one of the key plot points in Little Red Kit is that at first he does not succeed. Leo does not get the easy layup win that you're just gonna win because you got that disability, kid. Feel good stories, we fail too. You know what I mean? People with disabilities don't always get what we want, and that's okay. And as long as you push through, you can find solutions. I find that often as I was growing up, my mother was the Scholastic Book Fair lady, so it's probably not surprising I ended up the way I did. But the early attempts at sort of inclusive children's books sometimes veered way far left into patronizing or pedantic. And so it was really important to me to make it real. We're real. People with disabilities are real, and we have the same potential for human failings, foibles, and misadventures as anybody else. And so that's another piece of what I think we're trying to bring to the conversation.
No, you're definitely bringing that powerful message to the conversation. Another part of your conversation and your lineage is the fact that you were born there in Colombia and was actually born at the orphanage and things of that nature. And one of the things I'm always fascinated by, and it happens in the African American population as well, is I think that we have this tendency to want to lump people all together as if they are all the same in one group. And I've got friends of different kinds of society. So while I will use the term Hispanic or Latin or Latino or things of that nature, I do know for a fact that even here in Durham, where I'm at, there is a political person that has backgrounds with Argentina and another person that has background with Chile. And I can tell you that their political spectrum and their political ideologies are very different. And part of that is probably based on where they were born and things along those lines. And I'm thinking that would be the case for somebody from Colombia versus somebody from Costa Rica. And I'm just picking on two of the Latin Americans that have key names and everything. But I'm just wondering, as one that I'm assuming identifies partially, maybe not even totally, I don't know all of your background, but I'm assuming that you identify partially as one in the Hispanic or Latin community. Is that something that sometimes bothers you when you hear people use the terms and try to put everybody in the same boat, even sometimes in music? Because I've worked in festivals, and sometimes they'll be like, we got to get a Latin act, and I'm going like, well, are we getting a Mexican act? Are we getting a Brazilian act? Or what exactly are we getting?
I mean, I come to this from like two very interesting perspectives. I'll start with the publishing perspective. Nothing will key you into the nuance of culture more than trying to figure out how you want to translate your book, which seems like very random. But, you know, if you want to translate your book into Spanish, which Spanish are you translating it into? Are you translating it into Iberian Spanish, Puerto Rican Spanish, Colombian, Costa Rican, or Dominican Spanish? They're all different. And I think for most Western English speaking natives, you know, that level of nuance tends to often escape the conversation. It doesn't even often factor in. And I think mainstream white Western culture tends to erase nuance. Okay. And as such, when people from that culture are brush up against people like me who are like across 35 different boxes, you know, the question of culture to me is always very interesting because I was adopted as an infant from an orphanage in Colombia by an Iranian who was living in America, who was married to an Italian-Irish New Yorker. So, you know, that's a bit of a potpourri, if you will. And as a result, I was raised, you know, I wasn't told I was adopted until I was about 11. So I was raised assuming I was Persian, Italian, Scottish, Irish, you know, and then I was like, oh, you know, of course it was very casually dropped to me. My father was very blasé about it. Just kind of mentioned it in passing while mowing the lawn one day. And I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Got it. Okay. I kind of looked like my adoptive parents as well. Like when you look at like a picture of the three of us, you could kind of see like, oh, you kind of look like that, you know, and I was born on my mother's father's birthday. We had the same cleft chin. It's just like kind of worked out that way. But as a result, you know, when the whole Rachel Dolezal thing happened, there was a term that she threw around that drove those of us in the adoption community a little crazy, which was transracial, because she tried to say she could be transracial and trying to adopt the language of the transgender community for her cause, if you want to call it that. And what transracialism actually is, and actually means, is that you are raised a different race or ethnicity than the ones you actually are. So for me, I'm transracially Iranian, Italian, Irish, and Scottish, but I'm actually Colombian. So I consider myself all of these things because I was enculturated into them. And so I think that also influences, of course, what we're doing with Little Red Fashion, because millions of us on this earth don't fit into the neat little box on a census chart. And we need to do a better job as a culture in acknowledging these gray areas and having conversations that render them more comfortable to have in the first place.
No, I can definitely see that. One of the guests that we have regularly on our news show, and we do a show called World Edition. He's actually from Australia, and I think he's of Fiji background, and he might have some other background as well. But he's definitely lived in Australia for a number of years. But he oftentimes wonders if, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but it seems that in our conversations that he feels that it might be better for some of the communities to do more assimilation than they are actually doing in that sense. And I think he's specifically talking about the African American population, but I could probably argue that about some other populations as well. So whether you were talking to that gentleman, if you had a chance to talk to him, or just in general, what do you think is the importance of empowering marginalized communities? Or do you even think that it is important, or would you be a more fan of integration, assimilation kind of work? Or do you think that some of these communities do need to have like their own pocket communities? Because you did mention that you have some Italian background and everything, and I do know that in New York there's definitely some Italian pockets that exist.
Yeah, I think that a framework that requires assimilation / integration in a pluralistic global society is impossible. And should be, in the sense that assimilation implies there is a dominant culture that is prescribing social mores, and then it is up to marginalized populations to fit within them. I don't think that's good. I think we do best as people, as cultures, as groups, when we are empowered to have agency, to write our own stories, tell our own narratives, build our own communities. And then once we have our safe, definition of self as a collective, finding that, then you find the common ground between disparate groups. Rather than forcing groups to subsume elements of their identity, their culture, their customs, their practices, rather than demanding they sort of give a blood sacrifice of their culture in order to fit in, that's only builds resentment. You're fitting square pegs in round holes and then getting confused as to why there's all these little extra corner bits coming off at the seams because you've shoved the square in the round hole. And so, in short, no, I don't think that's a good thing. I think assimilation is a personal choice. For example, when my father came to the United States, he hacked off a piece of his last name, and that was his choice from an assimilative standpoint. As his child, he chose not to teach me Farsi, for example, because he didn't want me to speak Farsi and English. He just wanted me to speak English. I taught myself some Farsi when I was older, but I definitely, to say I resent it is incorrect, but I definitely would have appreciated had he not had this assimilationist narrative sort of implanted in him as an indicator of his Americanness as he went forward. So I personally think assimilative conversations are best left to individual families and groups to decide what they want. But I also think that it is essential that anyone in a position of either power, authority, curatorial oversight, meaning if you're putting out media or you're putting out anything that people can consume, to empower those historically marginalized voices. Because especially in deeply entrenched industries, again, like publishing, fashion, technology, we need to do better. We need to have our boardrooms reflect reality. We need to have, corporate social responsibility reevaluated to see where it's actually responsible or it's just a PR veneer. I think that it is important that those who create media, create content, create narratives, do so responsibly. I think a really good example of this from the publishing world is American Girl dolls, which sounds very random, but the way that American Girl as a company, even in the 90s, was rolling out their titles about marginalized communities, whether it was the indigenous community or they were trying to represent a certain voice, they convened panels, they had working groups, they had buy-in from those groups themselves to tell authentic stories rather than appropriating them. I always say you want to do appreciation over appropriation any day. And I think that empowering and uplifting historically marginalized voices, especially in 2021, is essential because we're still in this equilibrium period where as a culture, we're trying to even the playing field, at least many of us, and it really behooves us to do so with intentionality.
I agree, and I'm glad you brought that idea of appreciation because I was actually having this conversation on another show versus appropriating because that's actually parallel to the example that I was given because I went to Marquette University and when I was there, we were the we were the Warriors, and there was
Mhm.
actually a relationship between the Warriors and one of the Native American tribes. So, and one of the points of time during that history, there was actually like maybe some celebratory dancing and things, but it was also a chance to educate. So in that case, I think it was more of an appreciation, to borrow your term and everything, versus an appropriation. Whereas there have been other cases where I think it was more of an appropriation and some very stereotypical kind of views and things along those lines. And that to me is more appropriation versus appreciation. Now, what we did
Yeah.
eventually, because of some other pressures that were brought down on the school, changed the name and they are now the Golden Eagles. But definitely, I even sometimes slip up and call them the Warriors. But I'm glad that you brought up that difference because that's even the way that I feel about it as well. But from a fashion standpoint, I was wondering, what do you think when you hear about people, and this is actually fashion and the corporations, because we do know that even in the 21st century, there have been cases of people that have had to make a choice between maintaining a certain hairstyle, whether that was dreads, whether that was other kind of things, or losing their jobs because the job was feeling that that was disruptive in one form or another. And we might even bring up, I know you had brought up earlier about the Islam culture, because I know that one of my jobs, one of the gentlemen literally did take time off for his prayer time, but it was understood and it was accepted by the corporation that I was working with that he was going to do that. And not everybody has those kind of understandings. But I was just wondering your thoughts when you hear this in the 21st century, when we're still having these kind of conversations.
Whew. Well, for let me okay, where do I want to start? So when it comes to the workplace criminalization of natural hairstyles, it is not the 18th century. We can dispense with the Tignon laws. We can dispense with this idea of natural hairstyles indicating some level of professionalism or not. That is it is racism. Let's call a spade a spade. Okay, it is patently racist to demand that someone is unprofessional for having their hair the way that it naturally grows out of their head, or for the protective hairstyles in which that natural hair is put in order to make sure that that scalp and that hair is healthy. That is a non-starter for me. If you're criminalizing that behavior by virtue of penalizing it in the workplace, you're doing it wrong, and you are on the wrong side of history. And I unequivocally denounce that behavior. I mean, I think it's ridiculous, frankly. And every time I hear about it, see something posted on LinkedIn, I just, aside from shaking my head, I'm just like, it's 2021. This has zero bearing on anything. And if you have people in your workplace that have an issue with that, cool. Those are your implicitly biased people that you should actually be looking at to see how they're, especially if they're in HR, looking at job applications. Are they circular filing cabinet tossing everyone with a name that has 3 syllables that they can't pronounce? Is it, that having an issue with black hair in the workplace is an immediate indicator to me of a toxic culture and leadership that, if it's not racist in and of itself, is certainly condoning racist behavior. So my response to that is do better, because there's no room for that. Or as the proverbial saying goes, ain't nobody got time for that.
No, I agree with you. Nobody got time for that. But the flip side of that I've also seen, and I'd love to hear your perception or perspective on this and everything, is that sometimes, and I know part of it is, the colonial nature of America, but the world in general, is there's that kind of divide and conquer mentality as well. Because I know that whether it was maybe the Asian population being put in a certain limelight when the pandemic first came out and everything of that nature, or whether it's even the way that we treat our own, whether that's around color differentiations, light versus dark, even within the African American population, or sometimes even in corporate America. Because I've got some friends of mine that are definitely African Americans that work for companies that are Asian, and meaning that they're Asian owned. And they sometimes will tell me about their difficulty in understanding their Asian bosses and things along those lines, or their desires to want to make a more better kind of relationship in the sense of being able to understand them. And I'm thinking to myself, but isn't that similar to what happens with certain white women if a gentleman that's African American walks by and they clutch their purse? So I'm thinking that sometimes this is that whole divide and conquer mentality, and I'm sure we've even seen it in some of the sexual orientation conversations as well.
Well, I think that a big part of our problem in society is that we've nurtured this spirit of reductionism, where we
Mhm.
take extremely complex things and another extremely complex set of things and try to reduce them. And then when they interact, get surprised when that reaction is more complex than it first appears.
Right.
So, Friedrich Nietzsche once said, God is dead. Well, I don't think God is dead, but I definitely think nuance is dead. And I think that what we need to do is foster a culture that makes it okay, again, to be okay with those gray areas, with not quite having a clear answer, with getting uncomfortable to get comfortable. I think that we see the phrase, for example, identity politics, identity
Mhm.
politics, identity politics. The fact of the matter is, within the constructs of late stage capitalism, everything you do is political, no matter who or what you are. It is inherently political, just existence. Now, as a member of multiple marginalized communities, including the queer community, anyone who identifies as LGBTQ plus is inherently political just by walking out the door, whether they want to be political or not, because they don't have the luxury of opting out, just like Black men don't have the option of opting out of their skin color when they go to pick up root beer for their brother down the store and then get shot by a vigilante with a gun. And so what I think we need to start doing is, instead of focusing on insular infighting, or maybe my messaging was not as polished as someone else's messaging, and maybe I messed up a nuanced thing here or there, I think we just need to create a space where it's okay to screw up a little more, and it's okay to be wrong and then be corrected. But that only works if people are open to being corrected. And that's another part. People get very defensive over a lot of these things. And I think that we're not going to see seismic shifts in this kind of stuff until we unlearn being reactionary.
Yep. No,
And
I definitely think we have to unlearn being reactionary. But the other thing that I think we have to do is we have to learn some of the history of what goes on and things of that nature. Like I said, I'm here in Durham, and you're speaking of the LGBTI community and everything along those lines. One of the leading people in that community, or at least most people think that she fell in that category, even though I don't know that she ever 100% identified that way, is Pauli Murray. And of course, she has some very much great history in that sense, was one of the founders of Brown versus Board of Education and things along those lines. But I don't even know how much of that history is talked about, or for that matter, the history of the protests that took place there in New York that were kind of the launch of the LGBTI movement and things of that nature. So I don't know how much of those are not covered by our history books, and I wish that they were covered by history books. And then we have these divides that happen as well, because I do know that, one of the, I won't call it tropes, but one of the stereotypes that goes on is that the quote unquote Black church can never get along with the LGBTI community because of the fact that they are on opposite sides of an issue, whatever that issue is, whether that's morality or whatever it is in that regards. But I do know that Reverend Barber, who's a family friend, is all about trying to do, as you're talking about, even with Little Red Fashion, letting people speak their own truth and also share their truth with each other and all of that. But I'd love to hear your thoughts when you hear people that try to put that divide between the African American population and the LGBTI community, much in the ways that I just throw it out there.
I mean, so let me preface by saying I, being a non-Black person, don't really want to speak for the Black community, but I will also say that as a person of faith, theology, religious identity, let's think of that as one bucket, okay? Gender identity, sexual orientation, gender expression, separate bucket. There are all sorts of people of faith, of all types of faiths, that are queer. And to say implicitly that there is this sharp divide between the Black church and queer people discounts a giant slice of gray area in the middle of people of faith who are Black and who are looking for a spiritual home.
Mhm.
And so I feel that what's needed is more dialogue rather than saying, I'm in camp A, you're in camp B, ne'er the twain shall meet. We should be having churches, having more roundtable conversations with their more liberal counterparts who are also within the faith community, you know. And I think also it's very difficult for me as someone who considers myself a person of faith to reconcile this idea that we can simultaneously entertain multiple versions of Christianity, but cannot necessarily entertain a Christianity that is open and affirming. You know, if you look at, for example, the United Church of Christ and UCC and their open and affirming doctrine, you're not going to see a similar statement from evangelicals. That's just not going to happen. And so part of the conversation is also about knowing where to put your message. You know, I don't think you're going to, it's not going to be it's going to be an uphill battle to pivot someone from Westboro Baptist Church to PFLAG and, you know, supporting anything in the queer community. It's just not, it's an about fast. So what I think is really needs to happen is there needs to be more points for dialogue and more opportunities for storytelling and exchange. Because, I mean, I've been in many churches, I've been in many prayer meetings for the Baha'i faith. I happen to consider myself a little bit of sort of like a religious buffet. You know, I was raised Jewish, my mother was Catholic, I was a Buddhist for the past 15 years, then I was Christian. So I've been a little bit of everything. And what that brings home to me is really that ultimately we are all trying to figure it out here on this earth for the time that we have. And focusing on what divides us might give a short-term superiority like check mark for some people, and that's all well and good, but that's still ego. And if we're really looking to grow spiritually, then we don't need to look with our eyes, we need to look with our hearts. And so that happens outside of any of these external labels and constructs and other things. And so creating more dialogue points to do that is the only way we're going to solve any of those issues or perceived impasses. Because I got to tell you, one of my favorite parts of the Black church are Sunday hats.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, church hats.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to upset some aunties that are watching, but plenty of queer men have worked on lots of those hats. And, you know, it's kind of like when you see someone who's homophobic wearing Versace, you do the same sort of side eye, like, okay, but do you realize what you're doing?
Right.
And so I think if we had more dialogue points, moral of the story, then those moments would come to light and be more apparent, and there would be a common ground, however small. And every time we have a little bit of common ground, building on a little bit of more common ground, building on a little bit of more, that's a win in my book, because that is a step in the right direction.
No, I definitely agree. That's a step in the right direction. I was actually, and I've mentioned it a couple of times on a few of these shows, I actually remember, and I think it was my dad that brought this special to my attention, but it was a special, and I want to say it was on one of the major networks. It might have been ABC, and it was either Peter Jennings, or I think it was actually Ted Koppel, that did a piece on world religions. And this was maybe about 10 years ago or something like that. And what I noticed about that particular piece, and that's what I brought up, is that for the most part, there might be extremes on both sides, if you want to say extremes on the right or extremes on the left and everything. But for the most part, the core beliefs were the same, which was honoring your family, honoring your mother and father, honoring Mother Earth, honoring your neighbor, respecting your neighbor, and things along those lines. The core principles, and it doesn't matter whether you were looking at the Bible, the Quran, some of the Buddhist teachings, or whatever, the core principles all seem to be generally the same. So we can just get away from the extremes and some of the personality politics, which is what I consider like prosperity ministry and some of those other things, we would probably find that we have a lot more in common than we have in differences, which is what I think you are alluding to as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
A commonality that we have. Another thing that we don't have in common, but I would love to hear your thoughts about this. One of the founders of this network, Nick Palveda, is a big supporter of us changing our education system. That you may agree with and everything, but he's feeling that we need to teach more around fiscal literacy, more around the arts, more around even some of the things that we might need in day-to-day life. Like I don't know how we're doing with vocational training and some of the new things like AR and AI and all of that. But he sometimes will use the example of an English degree. And he'll sometimes, because he's a lawyer, so he'll sometimes use this whole question of how useful is an English degree. So that's the question I'm going to ask you, because he would probably be looking at you with an English degree and being going like, hey, can you really get a job with an English degree? And is it really worth having? Because that is something that he has brought up on several shows while he is pushing for educational reform and for us to change the educational system. But as one with an English degree, and I've got a journalism degree, is it worth us having these things?
I absolutely think so, particularly for where we are as a society right now. Ultimately, what I believe I got out of my English literature degree was the ability to construct, deconstruct, and reconstruct narrative and tell stories. And that can take the form of, in my consulting career, that has taken the form of pitch decks, financial statements. Those are stories. I could tell you a story in a spreadsheet. You know what I mean? And so I often joked about calling myself earlier in my career a narrative specialist. Because an English degree teaches you critical thinking, it teaches you analysis, it teaches you meta-analysis, and it teaches you how to articulate. It teaches you how to command an argument. It teaches you how to present a set of information that you have assimilated from outside sources and then reconstitute it into an argument. And so I think that's absolutely essential, regardless of what you go on to do, whether that's be an accountant, be an attorney, be a programmer, be a marketing person. I ultimately feel that, that's absolutely essential. I think if you're trying to reform the educational system, which is what we're doing with Little Red Fashion, frankly, what we're doing through Little Red Fashion with fashion is ultimately a use case for a re-envisioning of education solutions. Because that's what I call us when people ask, like, oh, so you're a publisher? I'm like, not quite. So you're an ed tech company? Not quite. We're an educational solutions company. Sometimes those solutions are books. Sometimes those solutions are, digital experiences surrounding those books using AR. Sometimes those are toys. Sometimes those are things like our body positivity blocks to teach kids about the diversity of different body types in a way that's accessible. I think when we want to talk about revolutionizing education, I agree with your colleague that we absolutely need to do more vocational training, more life skills. Some of the things we're doing with Little Red Fashion in that vein include what I call post-consumer consumption and care, which is a fancy way of saying mending and learning how to sew, take care of garments, properly launder them, to do any number of things, both make them last longer, but also stop contributing, for example, to microplastics. Microplastics are a huge issue, but if you're buying all synthetic garments and washing them at high heats, you're dislodging tons of microplastic fibers into waste streams. So just teaching people how these things work, and again, as I said earlier, pulling back the curtain on how fashion can be a vehicle for teaching about these things is extremely powerful, and it's meta-creative. If you think about people who revolutionized education, think of Friedrich Froebel. For anyone who's into Montessori education that's watching, you may be familiar with his name. Friedrich Froebel is the guy we get kindergarten from. And he created kindergarten really as a way to teach kids through creative play. He initially had his set of what were called Froebel's gifts. Anyone watching or listening, Google Froebel's gifts. I want to say it's Froebel. It is a series of gifts that you give to a child between the ages of 0 and 5 at different developmental milestones that get increasingly more complex and give them a way to free play and create through some guided visualization as well, with interaction between platonic solids, geometric forms, etc. If you look at the Bauhaus movement in architecture, for example, many of the leaders of that movement went to the first rounds of kindergartens and attributed, including Le Corbusier, contributed their understanding of architecture to the free play mechanisms that they were taught within the initial iterations of kindergarten. That's where we got the idea from our body positivity blocks, which was how do we teach kids about body positivity without beating them over the head with it in a pedantic, overly adult way? Well, you create blocks that are roughly based on body forms, make them interchangeable, and they can do whatever they want with them. But through playing with them, they intrinsically will understand that, oh, this looks like a person. Oh, so does this. Oh, so does this. That sort of free play is very important. Many of our later stage things that we're putting together with Little Red Fashion are focused on this idea of creative play. And this crosses fields to your colleague's point of, needing to better prepare kids for vocations and different jobs. Look at Ogilvy, right? Like one of the most iconic marketing firms in history. His entire ethos is underpinned by the idea that the magic in marketing and sales and things comes from play. Comes from play. That's this creative ethos. Look at Picasso. You know, true genius is the ability to recall childhood at will, I believe he is quoted as saying. And so, how do you build empowered kids who can survive adulthood, you know, and maintain just the right amount of childlike wonder, openness to new ideas, elasticity, and creative drive to innovate in whatever way is natural to them.
Fascinating you said that because, like I said, I'm a member of the Funky Eye Puppets, and that's actually part of what IPC, which stands for Eye Paint Creatures on Instagram, talks about is this notion of us actually getting back to being able to play even as adults. So he definitely talks to us as voice actors about, and some of us are professional. I am not one of those. I've come from the world of media, but they did like my tone, so I get to play one of those characters. But part of what he talks about is us trying to get back to even allowing play into our adult lives. And it sounds to me like that's part of the message of Little Red Fashion as well. Because as you were talking about laundry, I was thinking to myself that that's actually, even though I'm looking at my dishes and I need to do them right now, but that is actually something that I enjoy doing. And some people would say that that is not a quote unquote macho thing to enjoy doing, but I enjoy the feel of the water on the dishes and everything while I'm doing that. And I also strangely enjoy the sound of the laundry, because you mentioned laundry earlier, and I actually enjoy the sound of the washing machine and also the dryer. Sometimes I might even be overwashing because I enjoy the sound, but that's just my own personal opinion, because that's how much I enjoy the sound. But definitely, I was wondering, what do you say to the people that feel that some of these things are stereotypically not falling into certain categories? Because I do know that sometimes, even in the fashion world, we have folks that want to stick things in, you know, that's a man style or that's a woman style. But I have seen some clothes that I would think either people could wear of both genders. And definitely we see the same thing even when there are attempts to label something as an urban style versus a rural style. So when you hear of these fashion divisions, whether it's around gender or whether it's around location or whether it's around ethnicity, is that something that y'all like to have as Little Red Fashion, or is that something that y'all push back against?
I like to think we push back against them because, you know, our motto is that fashion is for everyone. Zero, that's it. That's the whole sentence. That's the tweet, as they say, you know, because first of all, as a field, you see, especially over the past 5 to 10 years, especially the past like 5, a proliferation of unisex fashion lines that are explicitly trying to do away with gendering in one direction or the other. Because if you look at the next most powerful generation in terms of spending power, if we look at what Gen Z is doing and what younger millennials are doing, as a cohort, they don't care as much, okay? And this idea that we need to uphold a certain gender binary or certain expectations in certain roles, like it's not manly for my kid to, my male child to learn how to sew because sewing is for women or whatever. Pretty sure that if you spend 5 minutes on TikTok, you will see tons of Gen Z men getting their nails done, full acrylic sets, because their girlfriend is trying to start her nail business or this, that, and the third. Skills are skills, okay? They are skills are gender neutral, period. And by foisting these sorts of fake divisions onto children, we may inhibit them from finding their vocation. You know, the next Alexander McQueen, a brilliant tailor, could be trapped in a male child with the raw talent who's merely being told you can't get a sewing machine because that's women's work or that's for girls. Or conversely, the next most amazing ballistic technologist in history could be a girl that's being told you should be a model. And she's thinking, I'd really rather design a new version of Kevlar or, you know, and get into that. And so, you know, for me, at Little Red Fashion, we're all about breaking down all of those barriers and leaving it up to children to follow their interests and their passion, while simultaneously providing adults with the tools that they need to understand what those kids are into. Because I don't know, last time you checked in with a kid, but when they're into something, they'll ask you 5 billion questions. And most adults don't work in fashion. and may not have the answers to the 6 billion questions that they're getting peppered with. And so our job is twofold: resources for kids and resources to distill some of the bigger picture things that are related to clothes down for adults. Something in the 2022 I'm really looking forward to is our expansion into our podcast to where we'll be doing fireside chats between myself and our in-house fashion historian, Rachel Elspeth Gross, where we sort of dive into the more grown-up conversations that accompany the things we're discussing here at Little Red Fashion for Kids, to give adults that context and so that they can better understand the why behind what we're doing.
Yep, I hear you. And speaking of an adult conversation, everything, I do want to get to one of the other things that you have a history of, which is not in, well, I'm sure it's involved in Little Red Fashion, but it was more of your early history and everything. And I had alluded to it earlier. Mom is retired now. She's been retired for a number of years and everything, but she did come out of the world of media, but also philanthropy, because she worked for Z. Smith Reynolds, and she also was the first president for the Golden Leaf Foundation, which was the one of the foundations that came out of the tobacco settlement money and all of that. So I do know a little bit about the philanthropic community, and I also work for a couple of nonprofits in the arts world here in Durham, serving on the board of the Carolina Theater. So all of that is to say, how do you feel we as a society are doing with our support of the philanthropic community? And do you think that even businesses are going to engage them enough? And would you like to see more of that taking place either within your own company or in general? Because I also saw that you studied fundraising management.
I did, yes. I am. In addition to always being a fashion nerd, I've always also been a philanthropy nerd, which is a very weird niche for someone to be a nerd in. But alas, here we are. You know, it's a complex question. For one thing, I think that there is a sizable section of the population that is completely turned off by the entire system of modern philanthropy.
Mhm.
They are sick of being asked whether or not they would like to donate $1 to $3 when they check out their groceries for a multi-billion-dollar grocery corporation, so that they can donate $1 that the company can then get a write-off for. I think that there is an enormous percentage of Gen Z that is looking for better ways to do that. And a really good example, to circle back to our Web3 conversation, is through the use of NFTs and decentralized autonomous organizations. Because just this week, Constitution DAO is a decentralized autonomous organization that crowdfunded within, I think it was 9 days. Don't quote me on that. It's somewhere like 5 and 9 days. $200 million or so to try and buy a copy of the Constitution that was on the block at Sotheby's. They were subsequently outbid, but what we see in these early days of Web3 is a wholesale shift away from top-down models, away from centralization. And by its very nature, traditional philanthropy is top-down. From its very origins in the Renaissance with the Medici family to today, you can see a clear through line. And I think most young people, especially under the age of 30, they're fed up with it. They're nihilistic about it in some regards. And that's why you see it becoming harder and harder for nonprofits doing things the old way to engage those donors. And that's why so many of them are focusing on, older folks, and then spending, 2 or 3 years getting a direct mail campaign to even out in terms of cost versus what they brought in. So I love philanthropy. I think that it is ripe for a shakeup. I think if we look at the prevailing data from sources like Giving USA and, Foundation Center, what we really see is that people want more direct voice in what their donations are doing and how they're spent. So rather than, let's say, donating and doing all the research, anyone who's getting a windfall of some kind, they're going to throw it in a donor advised fund and figure it out later. Take their tax deduction when in the year they get their windfall, and then figure it out. So rather than what would normally have happened back in the day, where they start a foundation, they get a board, they do the whole shebang. No, they just throw it in a donor advised fund managed by someone who's an affinity group. If they're Jewish, maybe it's the UJA. If it, whoever it might be. But ultimately, I think in general, the philanthropic sector, the third sector, is due for a reckoning with the way in which it navigates questions of ethics, transparency, and operations. And I think that a lot of the solutions lay in blockchain technology. In fact, just today, I want to say Coinbase put out, I saw it in my inbox this morning, the rise of crypto philanthropy. And
Yeah.
a big part of that is because decentralization, decentralized finance, and blockchain technologies cut out all the places where the more corruptible among us might hide a self-dealing deal here or a padded thing here. It's all transparent, it's all on the blockchain, and it's all hyper efficient. Smart contracts, I think, are going to shake up not only the worlds of intellectual property, but the world of philanthropy. And so for me, that's why I've been very bullish on it and studying it extensively, because I like to think that decentralized autonomous organizations will become the future of philanthropy in many ways. And that is going to rub a lot of people from the old guard the wrong way, because they won't have the sort of control that they are used to in that top-down model, to which I say tough cookies, because they're just going to end up looking like Violet, the Countess of Grantham,
Yeah.
ravaging against modernity, because you can't put certain toothpaste back in the tube. And I think decentralization and blockchain, as well as Web3, is that kind of toothpaste.
No, I agree, and I definitely see what you're saying. And even when Mom was working at those nonprofits, and I've seen it even with some of the art nonprofits, they used to have this idea that the money would come to them and it would come to them endlessly. And most of the nonprofits that I'm aware of, they wanted them to kind of wean themselves off of the money and to find other sources. But then they would get into this whole habit of staying on it for 15, 20, 25, 30 years. So I do know
Yeah,
that you're
yeah.
absolutely right that the old model was not working in the first place, because the original model was you get a certain amount in the fifth year and go down, so that by the final year of the 0 year, you're supposed to be able to be at least predominantly independent, if not totally independent.
Right. And what it turned into is then you just have a revolving door of big fish funders whose
Right.
interests are the ones that ultimately get served. No offense to any major gifts officers watching. That model is no longer sustainable. And honestly, what it does, old school philanthropy, I really think it perpetuates top-down structures that just have no place in a future state society. And I think this transition is going to be very interesting, because it's coming at the same time as we see one of the single largest generational transfers of wealth in human history. So, I think in the next 5 to 10 years, the landscape of philanthropy will radically shift, and old guard better get ready, because I have my finger on the pulse of the way that Gen Z is responding both to traditional models of philanthropy, but more importantly, these new technologies that can be applied to philanthropy. And my gut tells me that that is the future. And so organizations that aren't prepared for that kind of decentralized future, that takes away a giant chunk of the power they've been accustomed to, for some of them for 100 plus years, that's going to be difficult for them. So
No, I definitely agree. That's going to be very difficult for them and everything. One of the things I was curious about is when you've launched this business and you've had it now for a while and everything, how did you deal with those people that are the naysayers? I know that sometimes I've even had my own careers where I've self-sabotaged myself. So I do know that we can be our own worst enemies, and particularly as entrepreneurs. So I was just wondering how you dealt with them, and also how you got around that little voice in your head. And sometimes that little voice in the head can also be an encourager, but it can also be a pessimist. So I'm just talking about both the outside sources and the internal sources. So as one that has been in that space, and definitely have a lot of listeners that are in the entrepreneurial space, I'm sure that they would love to hear how you dealt with both of those nagging voices, the external voice and the internal little voice that might have been telling you, what the heck are you thinking? Trying to start a little red fashion.
I have a really simple answer to both. And pardon my language, but I just tell them to shut the fuck up. I'm a very big supporter, like a very big fan of Gary Vee. For those of you who, your listeners that are Vaynerchuk fans, one of the reasons I really love his philosophy in general is I have a very Little Red Fashion is a very complex mission that runs contrary to multiple large multinational entrenched systems. So I have a very big vision, and I'm just one guy. So I just keep my head down and go forward in the knowledge that I'm bringing something into the world that 10-year-old me needed, and that lots of other 10-year-olds now still need. And so that's all I think about. That's where it starts and ends, is the mission. Outside of that, naysayers, I don't, even if it's good or bad, So I mentioned earlier that I've been a Buddhist for a long time.
Mhm.
There is a concept in Sanskrit called upeksha, or equanimity. You might want to loosely translate it into even-keeledness, right? Things are not good, things are not bad, they just are. So when it comes to critique, when it comes to praise, when it comes to good or bad feedback, neither one really raises my hackles. I don't really celebrate when I get good feedback, and I don't get upset when I get bad feedback, because it's all neutral and it's all just feedback. And as a result, I crave feedback because I don't have an emotional attachment to it. I think too often with entrepreneurs, it's very easy to get so close to your vision that you're in love with it. You genuinely, like, you've romanced it, right? You've built this rapport, and that's your beloved, right? That's all well and good to a point. But being able to detach yourself from the emotional piece of ego, of I'm driving the bus, oh no, the bus got a flat tire, I must be the worst bus driver ever. It's very easy to fall into those kinds of traps of the mind. And as I talk about it, it reminds me, for those of you who are listening that enjoy TED Talks, I would highly recommend the one from Elizabeth Gilbert, the author of Eat, Pray, Love, where she talks about, what happened with the Renaissance, right? It used to be that the genius was the disembodied spirit that lived in the artist studio's walls, and if your work did really well, cool, your genius was great. If your work was really bad, your genius was kind of lame. And neither of those are your fault. And what Elizabeth talks about in that TED Talk that I really like is that construct of externalizing that creative force that was either good or bad or neutral was protective to the creative, to the artist, to the entrepreneur, for our conversation, right? But with the Renaissance, we internalized that. People like Da Vinci, Michelangelo, Giotto, they were masters, they were geniuses. Oh, see, they went from having a genius to being a genius. And the internalization of that mechanism has been detrimental to artists ever since. That's roughly the summary of her thesis, and I'm inclined to agree, because there needs to be a buffer between the creative or the entrepreneur and the outcomes of the things they do. Not in the sense that it should numb you to the reality of any given situation and what's got to happen, but that you should not get attached to praise, and you should not get hung up on criticism. You should just take it. It just is. And the benefit of that is that I don't really get emotional about when things go wrong. I'll give you an example. We had put together to start our seed round, pre-seed round, our business plan, and I ran it by our advisors. Also, anyone who's an entrepreneur listening, do not underestimate the power of a good board of advisors. Not a board of directors, not a board of directors like on your statement with the Secretary of State and wherever you're filing, but a board of advisors, because soundboarding is essential. And within my philanthropy bubble, I love board governance, so I'm biased in that direction. But you absolutely need to maintain that space. Keeping that space. That space is where you can percolate on decisions so you don't make a rash decision. Our advisor said, I hate this business plan. And my business partner and I looked at each other on Zoom because quarantine. She hates it. Okay. So then I said, well, what do you hate about it? Like, what's not right? She's like, I see the separate parts, but you're putting them together wrong. Like, just change it. So we gutted it, redid it. 36 hours later, handed her a completely different but equal length business plan. And she, to this day, is like, I've never seen any team pivot an entire model that quickly. Well, how did you do that? And I said, we weren't attached to the one we gave you. A model is a model is a model. Whatever gets the ball down the field is the play we want to go with. If I was attached to my version of the play, I'm not going to want to hear it. Okay, well, then you're not going to have a really good time on this roller coaster called entrepreneurship. So be ready to pivot. Be ready to change. When that doesn't go well, I'll tell you what that looks like. When I was consulting in cannabis a number of years ago, we had a client that came to us about 10 days before a permit application date. And they handed us what I will affectionately call a patchouli-scented pile of feelings. because they were very much a stereotypical person you would see entering the cannabis space with, mommy and daddy's money.
Yeah.
And so, God bless them, their whole model had to be gutted. So we had 10 days, my business partner and I, to raise them $5 million in capital, gut a business plan, and bring on a team to execute it. We did. However, because they were attached to what they first gave us, they did not want to use our, interior designer who was an expert in, commercial renderings for cannabis applications. It was for a lounge permit and things like this. As a result, instead of their application out of a couple hundred ranking in the top 10 to get a permit, well, they lost points because we had to submit our application plus their renderings, which were subpar. They placed 23rd. They would have placed last with what they originally gave us. So that attachment to a completely arbitrary perceived element of control, for them it was their renderings, right? It was the only thing like they felt they could control in this whole crazy hectic 10-day period where my partner and I were completely reassessing their whole model and we're gutting it. It resulted in them not getting their permit. Yeah. And then after the fact, they said, oh, John, I wish we had just done the renderings. And I was like, she was there. We were ready. We were rushing it. She was prioritizing us at a discount because of personal relationships. But it didn't happen. And they did not get their permit. And they did not. And of course, then their funder rescinded the funding. So they had $5 million in escrow that we raised them during that period. So moral of the story, over attachment to anything you're doing, whether it's strategically, whether it's the longer you make a mistake, you don't undo the mistake. You just make the mistake longer. It's always better to just say, this isn't working. Let's pivot.
No, that makes a lot of sense.
Emotional detachment is what makes it possible.
You
gotta zoom out.
Yep, I can definitely understand that. You got to have that detachment and everything. Speaking of which, I was wondering, in terms of the fashion industry, do you think that it gets, in terms of the culture and the creative world, do you think that it gets the respect of, say, the rest of the elements? I know that in hip hop, fashion is a very vital part of it and everything. I mean, they even talk about that fashion element as being one of the, I think, 5 elements of hip hop and everything along those lines. But I'm wondering about the overall viewpoint as to whether you think that fashion gets as much support as, say, the music industry and the film industry, and for that matter, the literature industry.
That's a complicated question, right? Because fashion as an industry, dwarfs those other industries for its contribution to the global economy and supply chain, right? Yeah. So, but on the other hand, to many, fashion's not a fine art form. It's an applied art form. It is a functional thing. Therefore, it's not a pure art. Yeah. This is where you come across the schism between costume and dress collections versus textile artists and textile art. And frankly, I think on that score, it's hair splitting. I think fashion, though, especially over the last 15 years, its prominence is growing for 2 reasons. One, it is ubiquitous. It is everywhere now. And 2, it's getting taken seriously because people are finally understanding that it's more than just fashion matters more than just to the clothes horses and the people who are fashion. People are slowly starting to realize how much fashion happens with soccer stars, for example, or with sports, anyone in the sports community, whether it's the sneakerheads, right? So that's still fashion. So the rise of streetwear and sneakerhead culture, absolutely gaining more traction and respect. To say nothing of the fact that companies like Alibaba have made it so much easier to get a foot in the door for an aspiring creative who wants to, let's say, start by designing hoodies or whatever and printing on blanks, and then maybe a couple collections in, they've made enough money and now they're doing some cut and sew, and then they've done some cut and sew for a little while, and then they start learning design fully as opposed to just printing blanks. And so I think that fashion's reckoning is upon us, and I think the metaverse, to go back to that for a second, is blowing that into overdrive. because you're seeing the rise of digital fashion, the rise of digital fashion, both in terms of like companies like the Dematerialized, Lusco, DressX, and buying like a digital garment for your digital closet, or having like a fashion NFT garment that maybe your avatar will later be able to wear in one metaverse or another. Look at Fortnite. You know, Fortnite skins are digital fashion. You know, so I think that the combination of those things, accessibility and access to supply chains for creatives, social media, things like TikTok and hauls, which, you know, it's a separate conversation for the sustainability element on that front. I think fashion is at a crossroads, and I think that that's why our market timing for Little Red Fashion is so important, and why we chose to release and start this company when we did, because as soon as the pandemic happened, you know, we had been working on a rough version of this concept for 2 years already, and as soon as the pandemic started, as soon as it first became a thing, you know, I art directed this book through lockdown. And we rapidly pivoted because we were seeing the first ripples of the power of fashion in a post-COVID or COVID. I say post, but I don't even know if that's correct. But, you know, in a post-COVID world, we were already seeing the ripples through the industry. You know, when you think of the Great Recession, for example, what came out of the Great Recession? Uber, Lyft, all these transformative, disruptive technologies. So we view ourselves as a disruptor, not only to fashion, through the next generation of leaders and creatives within the space, but also for education. And as I was saying, as a use case for a way to take a creative field and use it as a lens to teach what may appear to be non-creative things, like STEM fields and other stuff. So I think fashion is on the up and up in terms of being better understood as a field, in terms of being better understood as a language.
Yeah, I can see that. Do you think that fashion is going to move in the way of education and other things? Even like I've worked at a couple of music festivals and music entertainment venues, and of course, right now they're talking about hybrid models. And you mentioned your meetings that you had on Zoom and everything. So, do you think that we're going to stay in this hybrid model, or do you think that there will be a time where we will actually see more of the in-person kind of retail stores and things of that nature? Or do you think that those days are slowly waning out and then we're going to head into more of a hybrid model?
I mean, we're going to definitely have more hybrid models, but I think that the nature of the retail experience, in my conversations with industry leaders on it, it has shifted already. People, even pre-pandemic, you see the rise of pop-ups, you see the rise of experiential fashion. You know, I think it was a Nike executive, but I could be wrong. It was, I think, in March of this year. I was on Clubhouse moderating a fashion tech talk, and someone brought up this fact that we need to move away from the idea of sales per square foot and reassess it through the lens of engagement, like social media, to say engagements per square foot. So you'll see the transition of the retail space from I make my sale here to I make my connection with the customer that then they'll go home later, hop online and order this thing. And so will brick and mortar retail die? Absolutely not. But will the brick and mortar space be an arena for experience rather than a place for the actual sale? That's what I think is going to, I mean, that's where my head is at, because millennials and Gen Z want experience over stuff. And when they buy stuff, they want that stuff to be a metonymical construct that represents those experiences that they've had through, in tandem with, or in conjunction with the brand.
Yeah. I did see a fascinating virtual mall. I think it was out of Chicago, and I forgot the name of it, but they were looking at it almost like you could be in the mall, but you would be actually watching it through your computer. And the young lady was Kimberly Stewart, and that was actually part of one of those expositions and conferences that I was part of. But she did give a run through, and it was fascinating because you got to see, like, if you I think one of the images was of a car room and a showroom, so you actually got to go look at the car or actually going for the drive, or you could touch down and check jewelry or the shoes and things of that nature. But I also agree with something else that you're saying, that at some point, even if you loved all that items, the items either needed to come to you through somebody like an Amazon, or you need to go to the store to get them. So you would still have
Right.
at least part of the store experience, even if you got the initial sale or the
Right.
initial
Or
contact through
and
virtual
you'll
malls.
yeah, and you'll never. Here's the thing, right? So like I think you'll never do away with a physical location as well, because even if you're shipping direct to consumer, but you have, let's say, a brick and mortar location, I can return my Amazon stuff that I don't want to Kohl's, right?
Right.
So there will always need to be that interface for customer service. So even if you're shipping direct to consumer and your boutique is really just an experience, it's also going to end up being the catch point where if someone does have a problem with the thing that shipped them, they're going to go back to that location so they can have someone in front of them to say, hey, this didn't fit, I didn't like it, something was wrong, a zipper was missing, whatever, da 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 da. So I think it's important, because I do think, I mean, as part of our Little Red Metaverse strategy, we're absolutely banking on being able to create virtual environments where our community can add value to digital garments or other like NFT projects that we're building and things like that. But I think also you got to think of the fact that, and this goes to some of the conversation we had earlier about uplifting marginalized groups, right? We need to be more diligent in the fashion industry about creating spaces both online and off for historically marginalized designers to gain the same type of exposure that their mainstream counterparts have relatively easily been able to get. And that means doing so in key markets. I was just having a conversation with one of my colleagues who focuses on working with designers who want to create luxury brands in Paris. And she's working on exactly that, building a showroom for Black and brown fashion designers in Paris, where it is notoriously more difficult for them to get into traditional standard showrooms, within the circuit, as it were. And so I think what we'll see is these online experiences often either combining with or mirroring a brick and mortar type space that looks much more like a fashion community center, where maybe, they'll have a roster of emerging designers and they'll do trunk shows or just, presentations and that kind of a thing. I know for us at Little Red Fashion, with our NFT projects, our goal is to fund spaces like that and pop-ups and, create an application process for historically marginalized designers to showcase their work, or, really the sky's the limit. Which is what I love about the space. Because no one's ever focused on children's fashion education before, we can basically write the script for how that looks. Because all the programs that exist are typically for kids who are, juniors and seniors in high school who may want to apply to Parsons Pratt, FIT, Central St. Martin's, whatever it is. So that whole gap between 6 and 16 is a pretty wide open space where they need places to go. They need experiences both in the metaverse and in real life that can teach them about what they might be interested in, regardless of where within the fashion ecosystem that interest lies. It might be in photography. It might be in hair. It might be in makeup. It might be in modeling. It might be in design, sure. Or it could be you want to be the marketer. You want to be the guy who makes the ad sets. You want to be the guy who, or the girl who does the textile preservation for a museum. Our whole ethos is just show young people the sheer breadth of opportunity they have within the fashion industry, and then nurturing their passion wherever that may lead them.
And you mentioned Clubhouse, and I'm actually a big fan of Clubhouse. How important have you found social media to be for everything that you're doing? Like I said, I've become a fan of it. I found some guests through it. I've also been part of the podcasting networks, and that's actually where I re-met IPC and the Funky Eye Puppets, because he had actually come here and performed as a haiku champion many years ago. But we reconnected through Clubhouse and everything. But I was just wondering, from a marketing standpoint, because I do have some friends that are very much bullish on the Clubhouse as a marketing tool, as well as Instagram as a marketing tool. But I was wondering, from your perspective, how important has that been, and how successful has that been for you?
Well, like all platforms, and this just goes for Clubhouse, TikTok, whatever, they all are what you make of them, right? And I was very bullish on Clubhouse when I first came to the platform. I was hosting, I was moderating maybe 2 to 4 rooms a day. in fashion tech or fashion consulting. And, I gained a decent following. But what I learned is that, much like in real life, there are many people who just want to hear the sound of their own voice. And there is a certain element of discernment when it comes to Clubhouse and these voice apps in particular in general, that I take everyone with like a margarita's worth of salt,
Right.
in those spaces. And so I think they're important for Little Red Fashion. We found some of our advisors on Clubhouse, but I myself have drastically reduced the amount that I am on the app in the first place because I, A, have too much to do, but B, there was not necessarily enough conversion into either sales or leads for consulting work that were the types of clients that I would want to justify the sheer energy expenditure. I think everyone, it's like any other form of social interaction, right? I'm an extrovert. I have a lot of social interaction in my battery pack most days.
Okay.
But Clubhouse and those apps can get very draining after a couple hours of, clearing the room and all that jazz. So I think they're important. I think all social media is important, especially for brands to gain visibility and build community and build audiences. We've recently been more active on Twitter, for example, especially because that's where a lot of the dialogue about Web3 and NFTs and all that is happening. But, I wouldn't say I'm as bullish on Clubhouse as a platform as I was earlier, because I think the thing with Clubhouse, their meteoric rise was largely, from my perspective, due to quarantines, where they hit the market at a time where people couldn't go out, where people couldn't do things with their normal social groups. So they built these social groups on Clubhouse. But then what Clubhouse did, and I don't think they nailed it, when they opened to the general public, it became a free-for-all. And the nature of their algorithm changed insofar as rooms that I was hosting that would get, let's say, 2,000 to 5,000 people in them were struggling to hold 100 people.
Wow.
And I spoke to a number of my fashion, and I'm also speaking strictly from the fashion side of Clubhouse, because that was really where most of my engagement was happening. A lot of people had the same experience, where because you had this proliferation of new rooms, of new people, and the hallways were getting cluttered with all these other junky rooms, and then you're having to filter those out. And I think that they missed the mark in properly phasing in the general population and tailoring their algorithm to accommodate it. I think their algorithm got, I guess I'll call it, system shock from all those people, and then it became a negative user experience. Rooms weren't holding the amounts of people they were, and the cost benefit analysis for participants shifted as a result. They were like, why am I sitting here talking to 50 people? Or for rooms that had run for a certain length of time, couple months, it's like, okay, y'all, we've had the same conversation like 55 times. You guys have had the same advice given to you. And there would be people where I'd be like, you've asked me the same question like 2 months ago. Did you take the advice that I gave you 2 months ago into practice? And actually, was it actionable for you? Oh, no, I didn't really get around to it. So there's also that. There's presenter fatigue after a certain point on Clubhouse. And when it's small communities that get built where it's a couple hundred people, we did Fashion Breakfast Club, for example, every morning. And you'd have people come in asking the same question every couple of weeks and never actually taking the advice they were given by one or more people. So eventually, 6 months in, you're like, okay, you're here to not take advice, but I'm not going to waste my breath if you're not going to listen. And so it just didn't, I think there's just a certain life cycle to rooms on ecosystems like that, compounded with the issue that they had as a general platform, which was people were able to start going out again. People were able to start doing things. And it was, I couldn't make the room that I used to make because I had to do da-da-da-da-da-da because I could go out. So I think Clubhouse, like I said, moral of the story, not as bullish as I was, but like all platforms, is what you make it.
Yeah, it sounds like it definitely has some benefit to you and everything, but maybe not the greatest benefit. As we get ready to wind down and everything, I was wondering, because there's a couple of quick questions that we ask all of our guests, and one that just came to my mind, and it actually has to do with Little Red Fashion. and all of that. But one of the things that we ask all of our guests is to let folks know where they can be found on social media and all of that. We've mentioned Clubhouse. I know that you're on Twitter, but if you can tell folks where you can be found at. And then the other thing that we have all of our guests answer for the most part is it is an international platform, international broadcast media / pod TV. And of course, we've got listeners in about 150 countries and all 50 states at one time or another, sometime in team live or team replay and all of that. So that being said, any words of encouragement or words of positivity that you can leave them either as we go out of 2021 and going into 2022, we would love to hear that as well. And I love inviting my guests back. So you are definitely invited back because I'm enjoying our conversation. And there are many more things that I'm sure we can unpack at a later show as well. So I would definitely love to have you make a return trip as well.
Oh, well, that would be wonderful. It has been a pleasure. I love easy banter, as you can tell. So for those of you looking to learn more about Little Red Fashion, we are at littleredfashion.com, where you can sign up for our email list to be kept in the loop of all the saucy things that we are building. You can also find us on Instagram at Little Red Fashion Co, like CO, or on Twitter at Little Red Fash Co. I would have loved them to all match, but here we are. And as far as sort of parting words for 2021 going into 2022, my wish for all of you listening is that you will use this new year as an opportunity to zoom out, breathe, find the space to reflect, and give thanks for the ability to even just do that. I think that a lot of us who listen to podcasts about self-improvement, entrepreneurship, we're always on this endless cycle of media of like trying to fix our business model, get, a leading edge on this, that, or the third. Just remember, resting and recharging and resetting are part of that too. So I hope that you will use 2022 as an opportunity to cultivate more space for yourself to just breathe, because that is also part of being successful and finding your groove. Because without that, you get fried. And it's really easy to burn out. And all of us, everywhere, no matter where you are, the past 2 years have been uniquely intense for all of us. So even though things may not be back to normal, we can get closer to it or a new normal if we create that space to just breathe.
Nope, I definitely agree. Just need to breathe, just take it easy and take that breathing space. It is very much a needed space at this time and everything. So I couldn't agree with you more than everything. The quick question I was going to ask you is, my friend Zach does have his fashion, well, not fashion, but he does have his funk band and everything. And I know he's always looking for people to align with. So if there's any room for a fashion collaboration with a funk band or any of the other music bands, I'm sure that he would be interested in that. So I might have to put the two of y'all in touch with each other, because I don't know whether you're even a fan of funk music, blues, jazz, or other styles of music.
I do like funk music. I'm a very big Deep Banana Blackout fan. Actually, they should be doing their annual show at Toad's Place in New Haven, Connecticut tomorrow or the day after. They should do Thanksgiving, or Funksgiving. So I do love funk. So hopefully we can make something happen. Definitely not just for your friend, but anyone listening, Jonathan at littleredfashion.com. If you have some sauce that you want to share with us, or you think you can help us advance our mission to empower the next generation of fashion lovers, leaders, and creatives, I'm all for that. And I would love to hear from you.
Sounds good. And I'm hoping that our listeners will get in touch with you. I'm going to hit that same 30-second clock that I brought to bring us in to get us on out of here. But I've thoroughly enjoyed having you and look forward to having you come back in the very near future to share even more of these fantastic stories that you have shared and a lot of your philosophy, because I'm all about encouraging people and helping them launch their missions and doing things that I can in my ways as well, because I'm all about being supportive and trying to create part of this new renaissance that I think that we are in the middle of, because I think we're in the middle of a new cultural renaissance even at this particular day and time. So on that note, I'm going to get the 30-second clock and get us on out of here, but it has been a true pleasure having you here and having our conversation.
Thank you so much, Mark. I so appreciate it. Anyone listening, make sure you pre-order your copy of The Little Red Dress because your support means we can make more books.
Sounds good.